All right, so we talked about the history of the Earth and the chemistry of discovering the age of the Earth. So the next step is, when did life show up and how did it show up? We know that in the beginning, there was no life on planet Earth. And so we do follow some scientists that always seem to get recognition in the textbook because they were the first to write it down, put it in a journal. So Oparin and Haldane are the two scientists that we tend to learn in our textbook that put out that first hypothesis of what early Earth was like. They hypothesized that in the atmosphere, early Earth would have had ammonia, hydrogen gas, water vapor, hydrocarbons like methane. Now, this is not a big leap. This is what comes out of volcanoes today. So if it comes out of volcanoes today, it probably came out of volcanoes back then too. They also then hypothesized that with high temperatures, UV light, lightning, those chemicals in the air could combine to form organic compounds like amino acids, because that's all the right elements to make amino acids. And then the idea would be, once the Earth started to cool and water started to collect on planet Earth, so at first there was no ocean. That's kind of interesting too when you think about it. All the water that was on the Earth would have been in the atmosphere. But eventually the Earth cools down and water can condense and turn into liquid, and then it's going to form the oceans that we have today. And so then these organic compounds like amino acids could be in the water. Now we have a lot of UV light. We probably have a lot of lightning. It's still fairly warm. And that could allow for dehydration synthesis of amino acids to form proteins. So that's what they wrote down. This is all hypotheses based on very good education and knowledge of the past. So next in our story is Miller and Urey. So these are another two pairs of scientists who decided that based on what they read it from Oparin's hypothesis, they would try to test that. And they thought, I wonder if we could make amino acids that way. So they designed an experiment. It looks like this, where this is a closed system. Have water here, Bunsen burner, boiling the water. So the water turns to steam or water vapor, which is what it is when it's in the atmosphere. And then up here in this bulb, they've added methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, and then they also put a spark through it like lightning. So the water vapor, the ammonia, the hydrogen gas, the methane, the lightning together. And then this is the condenser. So then it goes through an area that's cool. So it makes the water vapor condense and turn back into liquid. And anything else that was created is going to be in the water too. So they let that go round and round for 7 days. After 7 days, they took a sample. And what do they find in here? Amino acids. Bingo, right? So they win. They discovered that, yes, this setup would produce amino acids. That's step number one in how we're going to get life on planet Earth. So they found amino acids after a week. Very important because it showed that, yes, organic compounds could have formed on early Earth. And then after that, they stopped teaching us, the scientists in the textbook for high school, and they just tell you other scientists have done all kinds of experiments, and they have made amino acids, they've made ATP, they've made nucleotides. And if you think back to the video I had you watch, they talk about RNA, which would be how nucleotides part. Now, other scientists have put it out there that, hey, we could be aliens, right? That the organic compounds could have traveled to Earth from another planet via meteorite, or even cells could have traveled to planet Earth on a meteorite. So we can't go back in time. We can't go see. We can't prove that. We can experiment now to see, or check out meteorites from today to see if we could find evidence that that's what happened in the past, but that's all we can do. So that leads to the first cells. And again, conjecture / DNA analysis / fossil record is going to put this story together. But this is the story that scientists have. First of all, there was no oxygen on Earth. The only way we have oxygen is because we have animals or organisms, plants and bacteria that do photosynthesis. If they weren't doing photosynthesis, all the oxygen would bind chemically to other things and would not be in our atmosphere. So when we look at other planets don't have oxygen in their atmosphere because it's just not possible unless you have something putting oxygen back into the atmosphere all the time. So definitely no oxygen on early Earth. When we look at the oldest fossils we can find, we have found evidence that there were cells 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, and those cells are about the size and the shape of what we have today as prokaryotes. The next step in this thinking is, well, they probably were anaerobic, of course. There's no oxygen, so they're only going to make the 2 ATP. So remember when we think back to cellular respiration, anaerobic, no oxygen, make 2 ATP. That's fine. A single cell can live on that. And then they probably just ate something, right? Probably ate the organic molecules that had formed on the Earth because early Earth was crazy and hot and had the right conditions. But when you think about it, if you kept all these heterotrophs and they keep eating, eventually they run out of food. So we're going to talk about evolution. So when you think back to this, just remember that the environment is going to favor autotrophs. So eventually, if mutations occur among those prokaryotes and one of those prokaryotes mutates, basically develops a way to do photosynthesis, then that one would be favored and then would reproduce, would survive and reproduce and continue to reproduce. And then we'd finally have organisms that make their own food. Now, when we talk about photosynthesis, what I really should share with you is chemosynthesis, because that's probably the first type of autotroph there was. We know this, again, based on DNA analysis. You've seen the video about that. And we look, and there's a group of prokaryotes that we haven't been talking about in high school biology that exist. They're called archaea. So we've been talking about bacteria prokaryotes, and we've been talking about eukaryotes. And we just ignored this section in high school biology until today. But this is another group of prokaryotes called archaea. They're very different from our bacteria friends, even though they're both prokaryotes. And they pretty much do chemosynthesis. So if we look at this, they do chemosynthesis and they live in very harsh environments, places where we can't find other life. So I'm sure you've heard of like the Salton Sea or the Dead Sea or even the Great Salt Lake. All of those places that are super salty, we pretty much say nothing lives in it. Well, we're not telling you the truth. There are some archaea bacteria in there because they can live there. The rest of us can't. All right. And a lot of the archaea do chemosynthesis. So what is chemosynthesis? We're using carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide to make an organic compound. So deep down at the bottom of the ocean, we have something called hydrothermal vents. Basically, underwater volcano. At the underwater volcano, we find life lives right around the underwater volcano. It's warm in that area. It's actually super hot. But it's the sulfide that we know allows for organisms to live down there because they can do chemosynthesis. And some of the animals that live down there have symbiosis with prokaryotes that do the chemosynthesis for them. So that's how they survive. Again, your basic prokaryotes, so don't forget that. And this is the beginning, right? The beginning. We have archaea somewhere in that beginning time frame, beginning prokaryotes that branch to bacteria, that branch to archaea, that eventually branch to eukarya, right? So we definitely had prokaryotes. They probably did chemosynthesis. And then the next step would be photosynthesis in evolution with the prokaryotes. Now, today we have cyanobacteria. This is what cyanobacteria look like today. And they give off a calcium carbonate as a waste product that basically builds a rock as they grow and divide. So right here, this is called a stromatolite. These are found in Australia. And these things that look like rocks were made because there is a bunch of cyanobacteria living there, and they secrete the rock around it, and it creates this shape. Now, scientists have found stromatolite fossils in the fossil record, and the stromatolite fossils go back to 3.5 billion years ago. So that tells us that cyanobacteria were around 3.5 billion years ago, or at least the ancestor to the modern one we have today. So we know photosynthetic bacteria go back that far in our history because we have a fossil of stromatolites, and then we know what stromatolites look like today. So that's that picture. Now, once photosynthesis comes along, even chemosynthesis, but really photosynthesis, you're just talking all these single-celled organisms doing photosynthesis, adding a little bit of oxygen every day to Earth's atmosphere. And you also have to remember that that oxygen will react with other stuff and come back out of the atmosphere. So we actually think it probably took another 2 billion years for oxygen levels to start to build up in our atmosphere to what we see today. And you will also, you might not learn this, but, well, you saw the oxygen video. But after that, like the time of the dinosaurs, actually oxygen levels were even higher than they are today. So, and then the oxygen also eventually creates its ozone layer that we have above our troposphere and the stratosphere that protects us from UV radiation. And having an ozone layer is why evolution could occur out of the ocean, because the ocean is a natural UV radiation. So if you live in the ocean, you got a little bit of a saving from the UV radiation. But if you came out onto the land, you would get bombarded with it until we had an ozone layer. So life really couldn't even come out on land until the ozone layer formed, which wasn't for a long time. But once it did, it changed the dynamics of planet Earth, as you saw in the oxygen video. And then that leads us to, this is repeat from before. How do we get those first eukaryotes? Well, we just know some larger cell sucked up other prokaryotes to form a eukaryote. And we know that probably a photosynthetic bacterium would eventually become a chloroplast. And we know that an aerobic bacterium, remember aerobic needs oxygen, would have formed our first mitochondria inside of our cell. And so again, just repeat on endosymbiosis. And those early prokaryotes were engulfed into a larger cell to form the first eukaryote that would have been unicellular. And then eventually those eukaryotic unicellular cells somehow come together to form multicellular life. And eventually we get to where we are today. So that is the history of those early first cells and early Earth.